Welcome, folks. My name is Jez. I'm the Adult and Teen Programming Coordinator here at the library. So this is part of our new genealogy club. We kind of relaunched it so that we meet monthly now and we bring in speakers so we can learn about different topics, but we can still discuss what you're going through. And if you have questions for the group, we can go over that as well. If we are in the hybrid format today, so we have folks here in person and online. If you are online, know that we're using the webinar format. That means you can see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. So you can put any questions in the chat or the Q&A and I will ask them aloud. And do you want questions at the end?
Yeah, probably.
Okay, you can hold your questions until the end. We did provide some handouts, so you can write your questions down if you need to. And I just sent the handouts through the chat in Zoom, but I will email them to everyone as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Tina. Welcome.
I appreciate it. Well, thank you for those of you who are here in the room with me, and thank you to all of you who are logging in online. Thank you for sharing your morning with me. So we're going to talk about military records. And when we talk about military records, you have to think of it like layers of a cake, or like if you throw a rock into a pond, the concentric circles that are created as you're going through and you're looking at all of these different layers of records in order to tell a full story. So we're going to talk about looking for records locally. We're going to talk about looking for records on the state level, on the federal level, and then online. So we're going to kind of cover those concentric circles of how you broaden your search to find more information. And throughout that process, these are some of the examples of the types of records that you're probably going to use, or at least investigate whether or not they would have information for you. So things like county histories, I'll talk about that when I talk about historical societies. A lot of them had sections where they talked about military engagements and about the soldiers and the units that had served, both from the Revolutionary War all the way up to the First World War. Get a mic that works. There we go. How's that? Okay, so contact your local library. Ask them if they have any newspapers or any documents. Some of them even have lists, rosters of soldiers and sailors or nurses who were serving during military engagements. This local cemetery might have an inventory of veterans markers. They keep a list so they know where to go and place flags every Memorial Day and every Veterans Day. Your local library might also have oral histories like we do. We're part of the Veterans Oral History Project, which I'll come back to. You can find those sometimes available online. But then your genealogical and historical societies might have collections that were donated. I'm on the board of the Plainfield Historical Society and the Oswego Land Heritage Association as well. And we have all kinds of uniforms and diaries and medals and letters and photos that our servicemen and women have submitted to our collections over the years. So there might be unit photos where only the soldier who donated the photo is identified. You might be able to identify and spot your ancestor in that photo. And I'll come back to that in a little more detail in just a couple of minutes. But you also want to think about the types of government records that are created as well. So your county courthouse, regardless of where you're searching in the country, whether it's within Illinois or whether it's someplace else, your discharge papers might be available through the Recorder of Deeds office. If you were eligible for a bonus that was paid because the county was offering bonuses to soldiers or veterans, you might have that accessible to you. So for example, in Illinois has offered bonuses on more than one occasion. So there were bonuses that were given to widows and orphans after the Civil War. So if you had somebody in your family who was killed in action during the Civil War and they were in Illinois, there's the potential that the county could have provided the widow a bonus to help her get on her feet after her husband was killed. And then in Illinois, also in World War I, World War II, and Korea, they offered pension or bonuses to people who had served in those military engagements. And World War I is available now. World War II and Korea are still sealed at the moment. They'll be opening within the next few years. So there's the opportunity for pension records. There's all kinds of government records that could be available to you as well. And I touched briefly on military service organizations because things like the VFW in the American Legion, not only would they have their books, their intake books where they were writing the military service down of the person who was joining, but then There are lists of officers every year. Maybe your family member was an officer in the American Legion or an officer in the VFW. They're always having parades and events and picnics and ceremonies that your family member might have participated in. So there could be the potential for photos and more documentation, newspaper articles about them. I'm going to talk more about newspapers in just a couple of minutes. But newspapers are absolutely replete with military information in them. Not just what's going on the battlefield. They're not just giving reports on what has been happening, but there would be a column in the local newspaper where, from the camps, and it would be letters that the soldiers or sailors or nurses had written home that would then get reprinted in the local newspaper. Anytime somebody got married, there would often be a photo in the newspaper of them in their military uniform, getting married. Things like casualty reports, promotions, furloughs, somebody's home on leave for 2 or 3 weeks, that would be in the local paper. So newspapers are an absolutely wonderful resource. Not only are they a wonderful resource for your individual soldier or sailor or nurse in town, but newspapers are great for reporting on what's going on within the military engagement as well. So if you happen to know the unit, your soldier might not be listed by name, but it might be an article about the 313th Engineers or the 4th Division or the 127th Artillery. That still has your person in it. So even though they're not mentioned by name, it's still an important piece of the puzzle to tell that story. So newspapers can be a really beneficial part of your research. A lot of counties will also have enlistment records. And again, those discharge papers, and they would put them in dedicated volumes. This is an example, if you can see it, I kind of blew up the pertinent military part to that. I'm going to move over and highlight some things. So this one's from Will County. This one is from the First World War, and it's a discharge paper for Elmer Brockway. So it tells me the unit and when he served and where he was. But then there's a lot of personal information in here as well. So, it'll give me his date of birth. It'll tell me where he was living before he enlisted. It tells me when he was discharged. Again, when did he join? What's interesting about First World War records is the fact that they asked, what kind of health condition were you in when you left the service? And the vast majority of them, unfortunately, say that they were in good health when they were discharged, even if they weren't. So a couple of years later, when these gentlemen are sick because they had been exposed to mustard gas or other type of agents, the military goes back and looks at these documents and says, well, you were discharged in good health. And then they refuse to pay out a pension on it. And it happened to a lot of widows whose husbands had passed away. Probably the most famous example of that, for any of you who might be baseball obsessed like I am, Kristy Mathewson, who is one of the most famous pitchers in baseball history, had served in the First World War and had accidentally been gassed, wound up passing away in 1925 because his lungs were just shot after that. And when his wife, Jane, had applied for pension because he had been gassed in the service, they refused it because on his discharge paper, it said he was in good health. So that is very, very common. And you will often see that on the record, that it'll even say in the record that, he was exposed to gas like some of our other people in Plainfield were on July 4th, 1919, still discharged as being listed in good health. But these are the types of records that you can find, and they really do have a lot of information in them. So if you're lucky enough that the county has it and can provide a copy for you, it already gives you a giant leap forward in your research. If they don't have that paperwork, or if you don't know what county maybe that they had been living in or where they would have gone when they left the service, if you know that they had belonged to a service organization, or maybe even if you didn't, let's say they lived in Schaumburg and then moved to Denver and then eventually retire in San Francisco, I would be contacting each of those service organizations to see if they have an application for them. Because wherever they went, they might have joined their local group because they wanted to still be among people that they could relate to. And one of those might have that paperwork. So you might be able to find, like on this record, where it tells me that Leroy was in the Marines. It tells me exactly what unit that he was in. It tells me that he was living in Joliet at the time. And this one at the bottom for us in the room is hard to see. But for you on the screen at the bottom, you can read that a little bit better. But it tells me a little bit about how much he had to pay in dues, when he had joined. and his dates of service and his service number. That's the most important, is having his service number. So now I can go and contact the federal government and ask for a copy of those records. I'm going to talk about federal records in just a couple of minutes. Like I said, newspapers have an amazing amount of information in them. The scrapbook that we're looking at on the right-hand side, these are First World War newspaper articles that were cut out and put in the scrapbook here particularly. So you can learn a little bit more about Bill Pierce and about Mae Morrissey, Clay McCully, who actually wound up dying after the war because his lungs were shot also. We have Orrin Smith being promoted. Everything makes its way into the newspapers. They're very proud of their men and women who had served. There's kind of this misnomer that reporters were only embedded in military engagements during the 20th century. The Associated Press actually dates back to the 1850s. It predates the Civil War. And the Civil War did have reporters with them who were embedded, who would travel with the units and then report back on what was happening during the war and during the military engagements. So you'll find lots of Civil War era newspapers that are talking about military engagements in real time. The caveat to that is there's no 24-hour news source, there's no CNN, there's no MSNBC, there's no Fox News that's reporting on things as soon as they happen. They're getting their news by horse. They're getting their news by telegraph. There's no telephones that they can use. So information may be late or it may be erroneous. So when you're looking at Civil War era newspapers, Spanish American War era newspapers, you need to take it with a grain of salt. Look at the next issue or two, because there might be a correction that is made as more information is being received. So for example, somebody could have been listed as killed in action in a particular military battle, when in fact they were just missing. And then the next issue or the issue after, they run an update that says so-and-so was not killed in action. They're actually in the hospital, or they've actually been located, and here's where they are. So you have to make sure that you go the next couple issues just to be sure. Another important thing about newspapers as well is that we have to have a little bit of compassion. We know our history. We know how the Civil War ended. We know how the First and Second World Wars ended. We have an understanding of what went on during that military engagement. They're living it in the moment. So the information that's coming to them is all fresh. So these are mothers, these are, husbands, these are parents and children who are reading these newspapers, hanging on every word, because they don't know what's coming. They don't have the advantage of hindsight like we have. So when you're reading newspapers from a particular time period, whether it's the Second World War, whether it's the Civil War, look at that with a little compassion, because the information that was coming to them, consider the sources, how they were receiving their information, how long it was taking for that information to reach them. And then you will find a lot of corrections that come in after the fact. Another thing to keep in mind too is that newspapers reported on what was going on around them, but they were also reporting on what was going on with the war in general. So for example, each military unit, each military base and camp had its own newspaper. So whether they were at Fort Dix or Camp Meade or Camp Dodge or Fort Riley, each one of those had their own newspaper that was reporting on what was going on in the camp, what was going on in the war, as well as what was going on back home. Just like here back home, we're reporting on what's going on with our men and women who are serving, right? So you can find references to your family member in the military paper, wherever they happen to be stationed. You can find information about them wherever they're living at home, but you can also find them listed in newspapers in the communities that surround those bases. So a good example would be Rockford. So in the First and Second World War, there was a base in Rockford. It was Camp Grant. So Camp Grant had its own newspaper that was reporting on what was going on in the camp. Rockford had 5 newspapers. All 5 of those newspapers were reporting on what was going on at camp. And then all of those communities where those soldiers served is reporting on what's going on with their soldier in that camp. Do you see what I mean? Like, you've got concentric circles again that are getting wider. Plus nationally, things are getting picked up by the Associated Press at that camp and running across the globe. So things like the pandemic, when we're in the thick of the flu pandemic in 1918, in October of 1918, Camp Grant is reporting on the soldiers who are dying at the base. And then Rockford is reporting on the soldiers that are dying at the base. And then those communities where those soldiers have died are reporting on what's going on about the soldiers that have died at the base. And then nationally, Tribune, Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle, St. Louis Post Dispatch are reporting on what's on the soldiers that are dying at the base. Does that make sense? So there's lots of places where you can tap into newspapers to fill in information about your soldier's unit, as well as what's going on in the service as a whole. Now, how do we find these camp newspapers? Some of them have been digitized and are available online. Chronicling America, which is sponsored by the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress has the largest collection of military newspapers in the United States. The vast majority of them are not digitized, but some of them are available through Chronicling America, where you could take a look and find some of that. Some places like newspapers.com has some issues that are digitized from various camps and bases. Ancestry has Stars and Stripes. I think we're all familiar with Stars and Stripes. For the First and Second World War, the overseas European edition of Stars and Stripes is available through Ancestry. So they do exist in certain places, but if you cannot find them online, you could rest assured that they are most likely at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and you can contact them. But then places like the First World War Museum in Kansas City has some of those First World War camp newspapers. The Second World War Museum in New Orleans has some of those Second World War camp newspapers. So you could play around and see where you might be able to find them. For Iowa, specifically like the Camp Dodger, University of Iowa has a collection of some of those as well. So again, those circles coming out, you're looking locally, but then you're looking at all the additional places where those newspapers might exist. So we're most familiar with federal government records. Those are those enlistment papers, those discharge papers, information about the unit, but states kept track of their military as well. So the state would have what's called an adjutant general. So I like to compare the adjutant general to like Radar or O'Reilly because it's an easy way to kind of think of how the adjutant general interacted. So Radar O'Reilly was the clerk. It was his job to write down everything that's coming and going from the military base. If you were a fan of MASH during the Korean War, Radar's job was to keep track of everybody coming and going, all of the supplies coming and going, all of the food, all of the paperwork goes through one central person. That's exactly what the adjutant general does. The adjutant general's job in each state, and there's a federal adjutant general who oversees the military as a whole, but then each state has their own adjutant whose job it is to make sure that the military units within the state of Illinois or Michigan or Virginia or whatever state it is has the supplies, the food, and the materials that they need to function. So because of that, you can find records on the state level. Typically at the state archives, it depends on where you are in the country. Michigan, they have those records at the state archives all the way up to 1984. In Illinois, they're only up to the First World War. After that, they're at the Adjutant General's office, the National Guard headquarters in Springfield. Just depends on where you are in the country who has those records. But they're going to have things in there like the muster rolls. Everybody who's joining, they're going to have their monthly reports, their after action reports, which are who's coming and going each month from that unit. They're going to have their inventory lists. What do their supplies look like? Do they have enough horses? Do they have enough blankets? Do they have enough food? And then things like promotions, retirement. So an officer who leaves military service transfers between units, because in military engagements, sometimes you can have a unit that takes heavy losses and they have to either bring in more men or they have to merge them with another unit temporarily until they can resupply. Those transfers are all part of the state military records as well. And a lot of states did military censuses as well, where they're getting an inventory of all eligible aged men at the time, and men and women now, like the selective service, who were eligible to serve if and when it came to that. So in Illinois, they did a military census in 1862 to see if there were enough men who were of eligible age to serve in case a draft needed to be enacted. Those records are at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. Plus, my library has a copy of the 26 microfilm reels too. We purchased a copy. So if you contact the Plainfield Library, I can look through those and see if your soldier is listed, your of age male would be listed. And then those bonuses, those pension files, those applications, all of those live on the state level as well. So this is a letter that's written extolling the virtues of a doctor that they want to put in charge of a military unit. And it's a series of letters of people writing to say what a wonderful job he did and that he should be promoted to this task. You'll also find things like gentlemen who might have lost their separation papers, they might have lost their discharge papers, and now they're eligible for a pension from the federal government, writing back to the state adjutant general saying, can you please verify my service so that I can apply for pension? You'll find a lot of those letters listed in the adjutant general's records after the Civil War, like between 1870 and 1880. A lot of those letters came in. Here's an example of one of those monthly reports, and it's telling you exactly who's in the unit at the time. Some information about where they're from, what are their needs, what were their losses. It provides that information for you. The bottom record, in the state of Illinois, there was a fire at the Armory in 1934 that destroyed 80% of the First World War bonus applications. And this is an example of one that survived. You can see that the death certificate here is completely charred. I showed you a photo of Clay McCulley earlier. This is the application where his family was applying for his bonus, because as the family of somebody who's deceased, they were fully eligible for the full bonus payment because Clay had died. So they had to show that he had died. They had to provide a copy of his death certificate in with the application. And this is the charred remains of that. He had actually died in Phoenix. He had gone there for his health because his lungs were damaged after the war. There's an index, a card file that was intact. But again, 80% of these records were destroyed. So you can find the name in the card file. Doesn't necessarily mean that the record itself survived. So the state of Illinois just finished digitizing these, so they should be going up on the state archives in the near future. What other types of records are there? Those censuses, which I talked about. Sometimes they would do surveys or censuses after military engagements. Places like Michigan and Virginia, the Carolinas did a census after the First World War, kind of gathering information on the soldiers that had served in the First World War. Those are available on their state archives. You can take a look at those. The federal government did a veteran census that's available to you digitally through Ancestry and Heritage Quest and a variety of other places. Because the 1890 census was destroyed by fire in 1921, half of the veteran census was destroyed too. So everybody from Alabama to Kansas was destroyed, but all the states from Kentucky to Wyoming survived. So if they were living in Washington State, even if they had served in New York, those would still be intact and they're available online. Other places, service organizations, again, Grand Army of the Republic was a service organization. The GAR was founded after the Civil War to promote the Union, to promote camaraderie and service after the Civil War. Grand Army of the Republic is what's responsible for Decoration Day, which eventually became Memorial Day, celebrating the dead from the Civil War. Grand Army of the Republic had posts, just like the American Legion and the VFW have posts, and some of those records still exist in the communities and in the states where you're researching. Nebraska State Archives has a really good example of finding aids for finding military documents. So this is just an example of the types of things that exist out there. So if you click on that link, you can look through the types of records that Nebraska has collected, and then see if you're interested in something specifically, see if your state might have collected those types of records as well. So the state really does have a lot of really good information that they collected on the soldiers, sailors, and nurses that served from their state. And these are different from federal records. They're similar in a lot of ways, but sometimes there's added additional detail because they're focused only on Illinois soldiers or only on Pennsylvania soldiers. So sometimes you get some additional detail where the federal records are generalized because they're taking care of all units, but they're still an important part. So you're going to look locally, you're going to look on the state level, and then eventually you're going to move up to the federal level and look at national records as well. So unfortunately, there's not one place where military records all exist in the same spot. They're kind of broken down by type of record and by time period. So the National Archives 1 in DC, which we're most familiar with, it's where the Declaration of Independence is and the Constitution. Archives 1 has military records up to 1914. So if it was American Revolution, if it was Civil War, if it was things like Spanish-American War, Buffalo Soldiers, any of those military skirmishes and actions in between, those records would live at Archives 1. Also, what lives at Archives 1 are the Adjutant General's records for the federal units. So I was talking about what exists on the state level. There's an Adjutant General for the federal unit as well. So let's say everybody here in the room is doing Second World War research. So soldier enlists and gets sent to Camp Dodge or gets sent to Camp Grant. His time at Camp Grant or at Camp Dodge would be at National Archives 1. As soon as they're shipped overseas, as soon as they get on that boat and they start heading to the South Pacific or they start heading to Europe, those records are at Archives 2 in College Park. So only the stateside records are here at Archives 1. Anything overseas would be at Archives 2. And I'm going to talk about Archives 2 in just a second. So military and civilian service records, so those individual military service files. So I want to see everything that my grandpa did when he was in the Navy in the Second World War, or everything that, you know, my great aunt who was a nurse might have done while she was serving. Those records are in St. Louis. So the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis just reopened. Yay! They have what are called OMPFs, which is official military personnel files. So that's your soldier, your sailor. It's not what the unit is doing. It's not what the military in general is doing. It's just what your soldier or sailor or nurse saw. They also have court martials. They also have burial files. So if you had somebody killed in the First World War, whether it was from the flu or from military action, those files for the First World War are there. St. Louis also has what are called IDPFs, which is individual deceased persons files. So if you had somebody in the Second World War who was killed in action, those files are there as well. So you could get their official military personnel file of everything they saw when they were in the service. But then if they were killed in action, there's a second file that talks specifically about that act. You know, what were the conditions that day? What were the remains like? What was the process of either burying them or bringing them home? All of that information surrounding the death of the serviceman or woman. Those are in St. Louis. They also have on microfilm, they also have those muster rolls and those monthly after action reports that I showed you for the state. They have them federally as well on microfilm, and you can go down and look at them. So if you know the unit, if I know I'm looking for the 313th Engineers, I can pull that microfilm roll and see every month, look at those reports. Who's coming, who's going, what are their supply levels like, who's in the hospital, who's been transferred. They have all of those in St. Louis. And then at Archives 2, what they have are the more modern 20th century records. They have the unit records. So I want to see what the 313th Engineers as a unit did. Not the individual soldiers, but the unit. So that would be things like special reports. That would be things like muster rolls. That would be things like, I'm trying to think of what else is in these files. Promotions are in these files. So my Angus was promoted from supply sergeant to staff sergeant. All of that paperwork was listed in the unit files. Once they're overseas, those records are listed here. So the unit file for Camp Dodge is here, but once they arrive in France, those records are at Archives 2. Those are all there as well. So this is just a general overview on where you're going to find certain things. One I don't mention, Kansas City has the hospital records. So if you had somebody who worked in a hospital or was in the hospital, Kansas City is the place that has those records. And then here in Chicago at the Great Lakes National Archives, they have the records for the military bases for the Midwest. So Fort Sheridan, the gatehouse logs for Camp Grant, and I just drew a blank on that. Butler in Springfield, Camp Butler. Like they have the maintenance and the running of the bases. They have all of those records at the regional archives as well. So they don't just live in one spot. They're kind of scattered about depending on the type and the date. In your handout, you have the places where you can go to look for the forms in order to request these records, whether you're doing it online or the old old-fashioned paper snail mail versions. These are all available for you to download. So now what about specific engagements? Where am I going to go to look for particular records on the War of 1812, the Revolutionary War, Vietnam, Korea? Where am I going to go? You also have a handout that gives you all kinds of websites that talks about how records were collected and why they were created, as well as where you're going to go to look for them. So for the Revolutionary War specifically, men weren't paid. They weren't given a paycheck. They were just given land at the end of their service that they could then turn in, or that they could trade, or they could sell. It wasn't until later that the first pensions were issued after 1792. The downside to that is there was a fire at the War Department in 1800. So all of those people who had applied for pensions between 1792 and 1800 were destroyed. So they either had to recreate them by resubmitting their paperwork, or if the soldier had passed, there was no record that they had offered pension, that they had been offered pension. So it gets really hard when you're looking for certain pieces of information because records just don't seem to survive. But a good place to start would be someplace like the Daughters of the American Revolution. While there is the Sons of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the American Revolution is really the research apparatus for Revolutionary War research. Even if you don't have ancestors who might have served who are not the patriot in the Revolutionary War, DAR databases are still really important because it is a great way for finding people between the end of the war and that first every name census in 1850. Because somebody probably along the line applied to become a member of the DAR. And in order to do that, they had to supply a whole lineage of their family back to that patriot. So if you had somebody who married into the family or married out of the family, you might find them in that 60 years in between the end of the war and the first every name census in 1850. And there's two databases. There's the Patriot database. So I can look for Valentine Whiteman, who is my patriot, or Jeremiah Austin, or I can search the database, the members database, and look for all of those people who attached to either one of those people. So it's a great resource for finding both people who participated in the Revolutionary War and then all of those people in those couple of generations after. So those are the people that are hard to track, and the DAR is a great source for finding them. There are some good Revolutionary War records that are available through Family Search. They've got the Revolutionary War pension and land bounty application files digitized and available through Family Search. Ancestry has a couple of collections. The really not that strong Ancestry would kind of be my last resort when looking for Revolutionary War and War of 1812 records, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, because their databases were built off of a survey that was done in 1957. You always want to be as close to the event as possible. So you want to look at records that are 18th and 19th centuries. This 20th century database has a lot of holes to it, so I usually don't rely on it all that often. And then Library of Congress. So the memory collection through the Library of Congress has a lot of really good American Revolutionary War era maps, charts, inventories, diaries, letters, first-person accounts. So even if your ancestor didn't serve, they may have been impacted by the military engagement. This is true for the American Revolution. This is true for the Civil War. This is true if they were living overseas in places where military engagements are happening. They might not have ever fought, but their land could have been damaged. They could have had materials and supplies and money apprehended to supply the war effort or the troops passing through. So if you had family in Concord, or if you had family at Vicksburg, they didn't have to serve to be impacted by what was going on around them. So using something like maps and charts and first-person accounts of whatever military engagement it is can give you a really good idea of what everyday citizens, everyday civilians were exposed to just by being near the war. Other sites you have available to you, things like Valley Forge's muster list, all the people who are with George Washington at Valley Forge. Kentucky is just one example of states that have put together indexes to their land patents, those military script that was given to them to claim, not purchase, it was already theirs, but to claim land that was given to them for their military service. So Kentucky is a good example. Tennessee has one as well. Heritage Quest, which most of our libraries have access to remotely from home, has the American Revolutionary War pension files. One thing to keep in mind about this particular collection is it's digitized in black and white. So that old-fashioned, really narrow script is hard to read because there's not enough contrast to them. And they only digitized the pages that were pertinent to the war, not the entire application. So my Jeremiah Austin, it's 9 pages, tells me the unit he was in, his last will and testament is in there. That same record available through Fold 3 has 64 pages in it. And it's in grayscale. So it's beautiful to read. It is in perfect condition. I can read it without any problem. The Heritage Quest version is a little more complicated to read, and it's incomplete. So if you have access to Fold 3, either personally through the .com or through your library through the Fold 3 Library Edition, you would have access to these Revolutionary War pension files. You'd have access to the voucher indexes for those pensions and those land records. You would have access to that through that site. The good thing about Fold 3 is they were created by the National Archives in order to digitize their military records, because in the previous 2 recessions ago in the 1990s, they had built this gorgeous military research room, cost them $8 million. And they built this research room to accept visitors, and then the crash happened and they couldn't afford to staff it. So they thought, oh, we'll just digitize the records. If we digitize the records, there'll be no reason for anybody to come in. Well, what winds up happening? It makes you want to look at everything else. Like it becomes a loss leader, like, oh, you've got this record. Do you have these 4 records? So they found that they were busier once they put these records online. They were never slower like they were anticipating. But Fold 3 was designed to make these records available digitally online for free. So a pretty robust collection of Revolutionary War records are on there. War of 1812 records are on there. They're still doing, and I'll talk about it in a minute, they're still doing Civil War records, but they're slowly marching forward through the military engagements to make these records available online. Like I said, Ancestry has collections. They're not as strong. I would probably use them after I exhausted all of the other ones. They do have an interesting list of Loyalists in the American Revolution. This actually isn't the most complete list that's out there. There's actually a pretty complete list that's available through the Canadian State Archives. And there's a pretty decent list of Loyalists who returned back to England, available through Kew Garden at the archives in England. Talked about Daughters of the American Revolution. Even if you're not a member, you can still access their library for a small fee. So if you found somebody in the database and you wanted to know more, you could buy that application online. I think it's $10. Or you could make an appointment with one of their researchers for them to help you further. Or you can go there in person. The gorgeous thing about the DAR library is that it has materials for all 50 states, as well as some additional countries. It's designed to help you become a member by providing the resources to allow you to do that. So there's a lot of county histories, family histories, city directories, plat maps, and things like that to allow you to discover the evidence that you need to join. So it's a really robust genealogy library. It's not just Revolutionary War texts. It goes all the way up into the 20th century, but it's a great avenue of research for anybody doing genealogy, not just those doing military service. War of 1812, there aren't as many records available online. Fold 3 is by far the best collections that you're going to find. They've got the pension files that are complete that you can access online, so they're searchable by name. A lot of states have individual inventories of their War of 1812 soldiers and pensioners. Illinois has War of 1812 pensioners. There's an index to that through the state library's website, through the Secretary of State's office. Those are accessible to you for Illinois. Ancestry's War of 1812 records, they're terrible. Don't use them. They're absolutely awful. They're actually indexed by the officer, so you would have to know who their lieutenant or their captain was to find anybody in these. So they're really not helpful unless you happen to know that they served under Captain Chestnut. It's not going to do you a whole lot of good. I would use Fold 3 or Family Search first. And then Internet Archive has the original books that were done. So there was a 6-volume set of books to pensioners that was done in 1832. And Internet Archive has digitized these, and you can look at all 6 volumes. You can download them to your computer. And what those were, they're arranged alphabetically by state and then by county. So Illinois alphabetically, and then by county alphabetically within Illinois. So if you happen to know in 1832 that John McClure was in Perry County, I can flip to Illinois and flip to Perry County and see all of the pensioners for the War of 1812 listed there. If you don't know, it becomes a little bit more challenging, but that's the beauty of the digital index. It's OCR'd, so I can search on the name without having to know specifically where they were. National Archives obviously has the records for the War of 1812, so you can see their original service records, but you could also see those land pension files. Those are available through the archives as well. Other good resources, Military Indexes is really actually an excellent site, and they have all kinds of military records in there. Some of those censuses that were done, some of those surveys that were collected. They have an interesting collection of Spanish-American War records, which I'll get to in a minute, but that's where I found my Uncle Gus listed, was through Military Indexes. Blackhawk War is specific to the Midwest. It really only impacted Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Iowa. So if you had somebody who was involved in the Blackhawk War, your state archives and library are going to be the ones who are going to have the vast majority of these records. The National Archives really doesn't have much because it was more of a local skirmish of militia that were called up versus federal troops that were called up. So if you're in any of those states, check with your state archives. Illinois State Archives has a really nice set of links available on their website as well. If you want just an overview of what the Blackhawk War was, the Wisconsin History Museum, Wisconsin Historical Society has a really, really good short 3-page explanation of what the Blackhawk War was. But there's a lot of these skirmishes that occur across the country. I don't really get into things like the Whiskey Rebellion, which was specifically on the Eastern Seaboard in 1796. But each one of those types of skirmishes are going to have records in the state archives on the local level. So if I don't mention a specific battle or military engagement that your ancestors were in, if it's a localized fight like that, then you're going to contact your state archives for more information. Mexican War is the same thing. There were only a handful of Illinois units that went down to help on the Mexican border in 1846. The vast majority of people were from Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, and Georgia. Those are the places who are going to have those types of records. But there is a small collection of records from those who went down from Illinois that are available through the state archives. Civil War is probably the one that we're most familiar with because the records collections are the most robust, and they live in more than one location, unfortunately. There's an index of soldiers and sailors that's available from the National Park Service. And the reason why the National Park Service is so important is because they're the ones that maintain those battlefields. They're the ones that maintain the places like Vicksburg and Gettysburg and Fort Pulaski and things like that. Those people know those military engagements inside and out. And if you were not aware, each one of the national park sites has its own archives. So I could go to Gettysburg and learn more by looking at original contextual records that they have at Gettysburg. I don't have to go to DC. While DC does have records, absolutely, the battlefields themselves have really good collections that they've amassed over the years as well. So don't discount the National Park Service because you think it's the same as the federal records that are collected. By all means, it is not. They have some pretty good photo collections too that the federal archives do not have. But of course, you're going to be looking for records on the federal level as well. But one thing to keep in mind when we're dealing with Civil War records, the National Archives only collects records pertinent to U.S. troops. Now let that sink in for a second. They do not have Confederate records. Why would they not have Confederate records? Because the Confederacy, they were no longer U.S. citizens. They had seceded from the United States. They were not U.S. citizens. So the National Archives has a tiny collection of Confederate records that all relate to amnesty papers and citizenship files for those who wanted to become American citizens again. Once you have seceded, you had to apply and swear that you would not raise arms against the U.S. government again in order to be redeemed and qualified as a U.S. citizen again so that you could vote. That's the collections that they have. If you had served in the Confederacy and you had claimed a pension or you want to have the military records to those Confederate soldiers and sailors, you have to go to the state archives to get those. Georgia has a fantastic collection. It's called Georgia Vault, which should be in your handout. And it's all of the applications, all of the military service for those soldiers from Georgia. Same thing is true for Alabama and for Florida and for parts of Missouri and for all of those states that were Confederate states. You have to go to the state in order to get access to those records. What the National Archives also had are what are called Southern Claims Commission reports. So these are reports where people were suing the federal government for reimbursement for damaged property, stolen goods, people whose crops were burned or stolen. Think of Sherman's March to the Sea. As Sherman's coming through, he's burning everything in his path. Those families are filing a claim against the government to be reimbursed. 60% of those were rejected. Only 40% of those were accepted. They live in two different places. So Ancestry has a collection of the ones that were accepted. Fold 3 has a collection of the ones that were accepted. Only the National Archives has the collection of those that were rejected. So more than half of them were rejected. Why would they be rejected? There'll be annotations on there that say the US Army wasn't within 100 miles of that farm. You know, people were just filing claims to get money. Or you claim that you had never raised arms against the US government, but yet 6 of your sons served in the Confederate artillery. You know, if you raised arms against us, you were getting nothing. So a lot of them were rejected because their family members had served in the Confederacy, or they were nowhere near the actual engagement at the time that it occurred. Widows' pension files are also included in there as well for people whose spouses and children who were entitled to money. Freedmen's bank records are also an interesting aspect of that too. You don't have to be African American in order to benefit from the Freedmen's bank records. If you had ancestors that lived in the South, they could have, the person filing for the Freedmen's bank account could have worked for your ancestor. We're not talking slavery, we're talking post-emancipation. They could have worked for them, they could have been neighbors to them, they could have vouched for them on their paperwork that yes, they were the person that they claimed to have been. So there's a lot of people, both African American and not, that show up in Freedmen's bank records. It's a good collection to search if you had family from the South. And then some places online that have really, really good Civil War collections and records. The state of Missouri has a fantastic Civil War collection that actually talks about military camps and bases in Illinois, and Illinois units are represented in this collection as well. Virginia Tech has a collection of Civil War era newspapers. And then some of the South, which is in your handout, which I might not have listed here, has a full run of Harper's Weekly newspaper. And Harper's Weekly newspaper were those embedded reporters who were traveling with the Union Army, who were documenting and illustrating what was going on. Oh, here it is. So here's Harper's Weekly. So they're sketching what's going on during the war. Obviously, photographs couldn't be taken because of such a long exposure time, but they would sketch what was going on. So there's some really, really detailed sketches of military battles here, as well as very thorough explanations about what's going on the front. And then all of those red titles, all of those red words are hyperlinks that'll get you into additional pages within Harper's Weekly. So it's a fantastic collection of things that are available if you're doing Civil War research about your ancestor who had served, or even those who were impacted. Grand Army of the Republic, like I said, they were designed right after the end of the Civil War for Union soldiers as a place to come together. They're the ones that invented Decoration Day. They have very robust inventories of paperwork. So the New York State Archives has probably the best collection of GAR records that I've had the pleasure of working with. It's, again, just an example of the types of records that are out there. But they would host conventions, both in each state as well as nationally. So there's a lot of paperwork created. There's programs, there's invitations, there's badges, there's pins, and there's medals, and there's hats. There's all kinds of ephemera that's created around the Grand Army of the Republic. So if you have some things in your collection and you're wondering what they are, and they say GAR on them, this would give you a background on what those materials were and why they were created. I got to tell you how evil I am. So I have twins. I mentioned that to the group earlier. My kids are finally graduating. They're graduating from high school on Saturday. But when they were little, we would travel all over the country. I think I have a picture of them on every cannon at every Civil War site we've ever visited. But one of my ancestors had served in the Spanish-American War. And I was doing Spanish-American War research, trying to figure out where Uncle Gus was buried. And as I write, I abbreviate. So I'd write SPAM. So my one son looks at me, he says, "Mom, why would anybody fight over Spam?" And I was like, "Because it's delicious. Why wouldn't you fight over Spam?" So about 6 years ago, we were downtown at the Taste of Chicago. My kids were 12 at the time, and there was a Spam truck parked on the street, and it had a line that was a block and a half long. And my kid stopped dead in his tracks. He was like, "Oh my God, Mom, Spam must be good. Look at the size of that line." And I said, "Now you understand why people would go to war over Spam." So in my writing, I abbreviate Spanish-American War as Spam. But the Spanish-American War was actually two completely different engagements. There was the Philippine-American War, and there was the Spanish-American War. So when we think about Remember the Maine and the sinking of the Maine, that's the Spanish-American War. The Philippine-American War went on much longer. Spanish-American War only lasted for about 9 months, just shy of 9 months. The rest of that fighting, and some occurred in pockets all the way up to 1906, occurred and is actually the Philippine-American War. So it's important to understand if you're dealing with these types of records. Even in the National Archives, the vast majority of them are just listed under the header of Spanish-American War, but there are some really, really good collections out there. The Sons of the Spanish-American War, the one I had shown you previously, those are the two that had my Uncle Gus listed in them and told me exactly where he was buried, because somebody had inventoried Spanish-American War burial locations. So I found him in Poplar Bluff, Missouri, down in the Ozarks. But that's probably the best two places to go to look for Spanish-American War records, but they're out there. What happens if they didn't serve in military service during an engagement? What happens if they were just in the Army or in the Navy during peacetime? Those records do still exist, and they're at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. If it's records after 1914, their personnel file is going to be in St. Louis, but then their military records are going to be at Archives 1 because they're stateside. They're serving in the military stateside. It's not a military engagement. They haven't been sent overseas, but you can kind of see this inventory of the types of things that you're going to find in these record collections. So just regular enlisted Army, up to June 30th of 1917, those records are going to be in DC at Archives 1 as well. So you remember what I said about Confederate states. So they list Confederate state records being in here, but again, these are those records where the person is swearing amnesty and returning to US citizenship. So now 20th century. So now we're going to talk about First World War, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam briefly. So First World War records are kind of disappointing and they're hard to come by because even though we just celebrated the centennial of the First World War, First World War's never gotten the love and attention that some of the other military engagements have gotten. Some of the reason for that is we celebrate anniversaries, 25th anniversary, 50th anniversary, 75th anniversary. 25th anniversary of the First World War was in the heart of World War II. 50th anniversary of the First World War was during the heart of Vietnam. It never got the attention, it never got the highlight that it deserved because we were fighting at all of these other times, even now. We're in the midst of a pandemic and lots of other things are going on in the world as well. So it's never really gotten the attention that it deserves. And because of that, the US government didn't take the opportunity to digitize the records for the First World War like they have American Revolution, Civil War, and what they're doing now with World War II records. So there are some small collections that exist. If you go out the Fold 3, the vast majority of First World War records available on Fold 3 are actually foreign military records. They're British, they're Canadian, they're Australian military records. They have very few really useful First World War records available to us. But there are some collections that are out there. In Ancestry, the World War I draft card file, it's available in a lot of places. It's available through Family Search and other locations. It's not good and it's not complete. So just keep that in mind when you're using it. Because the first draft cards were filed in June of 1917. We had already been at war for 3 months, so lots of people had already enlisted. They're not going to be listed because they've already joined the service. The collection that is really good that's in there is the U.S. Army embarkation lists. So these are the men and the women who are getting on board the ship and going overseas to France to serve and then coming back. So if you have an ancestor who served in the First World War and you think that they may have gone overseas, this is going to verify it for you because it's going to tell you if you don't find them in these records, they didn't go overseas, they stayed stateside. So this is the best way to figure out whether somebody had gone overseas to France or the Canal Zone. So we had lots of soldiers who were stationed in the Canal Zone as well, and they show up in these records. Don't discount British and Canadian and Australian archives as well, because a lot of US troops were stationed with Australians and Canadians, and they're represented in their archives, in their diaries. A lot of them were stationed together. Like I was saying, these diaries are these histories of the unit. So history of the 130th Cavalry, or whatever it happens to be. A lot of US troops are mentioned in those diaries for Canada and Australia because they served side by side. Battle Monuments Commission database is those soldiers who were killed in action and were interred overseas. This is true for the First and the Second World War. So if you had somebody whose body was not returned for burial stateside, they're going to be listed in this collection as well. Another really good one is the National World War I Museum. Has some digitized collections online through their archive on their website that you can read first-person accounts as well. Here's the American Battle Monument. So it's not showing you the headstone, but it's telling you where it is, and it's confirming that the soldier is interred overseas. So this one for John Swackhammer, he was killed in action during the Saint Michel battle, and he's interred overseas, and it tells me where. You can contact them and request the photo. They'll take a picture and send it to you. They're just not on their website. So now Second World War, all of you in the room are interested in Second World War records. Because so many Second World War soldiers are still alive, the collections that are available digitally for Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam are slim. They're slowly starting to get additional collections online, but the US government uses what's called a 62-year rolling calendar. So if I went to St. Louis, if I went to the National Personnel Records Center, I could look at anybody's service file, as long as it's been more than 62 years since they left the service. So 62 years from today's date would be 1960. I'd be able to walk in and see somebody as long as they left the service before 1960 in person, but they're not online. So there's the only things that you're really finding online are things like court martials, things where people are being punished. FBI records are available in there. Plane crashes and things like that. Missing aircrew reports are available online. And then casualties. What's a casualty? Casualties in our mind, in a civilian's mind, are somebody who was killed. But casualties in the military's mind is anybody who has been killed, wounded, or sick. So casualty reports have people who caught the measles during the Second World War. There was a huge German measles outbreak stateside in the bases at the start of the Second World War. So my favorite patron, Mr. Pesich, who I interviewed as part of the Veterans Oral History Project, told me that he had spent 3 weeks in the hospital at Fort Riley because he had caught German measles. He's listed in the casualty reports. Dr. Raitan, my World War II history teacher from ISU, had taken the $1 million wound at Anzio Beach. He got hit in the behind by shrapnel. And he thought, whoa, I'm going home. I've been injured. No, they just slapped a Band-Aid on his tush and told him to get back to the front. He's listed in the casualty reports because there's anybody who was wounded or sick. So you can find some of your family in here because maybe they caught the measles, or maybe they did catch the flu or something else. So don't discount casualty reports because your soldier came back or your nurse survived. They could have gotten ill or they could have been wounded in some other way, and they're going to be listed in these reports. And usually in the reports, it gives you their service number. So then you can take that back and request the files from the National Archives. World Vital Records is a really expensive site. I again, wouldn't expect you to use that except for a last resort. But a lot of the digitized books that World Vital Records has are available now through Internet Archive, so it's a source for you. Fold 3 is always going to be your best source for modern military records, but Ancestry does have a couple of collections in there. Heritage, not Heritage Quest, just drew a blank on what it was. My Heritage is going to have some Second World War inventories as well. But don't skip the National Archives because they've been digitizing things like crazy since the pandemic started to make things available and getting them up online as quickly as they can. So they do have a lot of military reports, more of those unit reports, more of those war histories, those war diaries than individual servicemen, but they're still an important part to that story. If you have ancestors that had been involved in the Holocaust in one way or another, you have a list of Holocaust websites in your collection to take a look at. The Weiner Memorial Library in London is another good collection. It's in the other handout for you, where they've got a lot of first-person narratives and oral histories and things like that that are available. Aristolan is another good site for information. You can go and look. They still have the inventories of, this is what's heartbreaking, they still have the inventories of items that were never collected. So you can go in and you can see the things by surname that are still waiting for somebody to claim. So for my surname, my maiden name, there are 37 collections at Aristolan that are still waiting for somebody to come and claim them. Korean War and Vietnam War are both very similar in the amount of collections that they have online. The Stars and Stripes newspaper, like I talked about, which is available for First and Second World War through Ancestry, also has their collections up online. These are for the Second World War, they're the overseas newspapers. For the Korean War, I think they're the stateside papers. I don't think they're the Korean papers. So they're the local paper that was printed in the States out of Washington, D.C. Fold 3 has some collections available as well. Again, those Army casualties, that does not mean deaths. Army casualty just means anybody who might have been injured or who had become ill. So they're still important to check. For Vietnam War, actually for Korea and Vietnam War, the Navy cruise books. So we had a couple of people who had served, had ancestors that served in the Navy, had family that served in the Navy. These Navy cruise books are basically like yearbooks. So you're on board this ship every year. Every tour that they did, they put out a book, and it would be the high school photos. It'd be like the headshots of all of the soldiers that are on board, and then what was going on the ship. So you know, the pictures of the mess hall and all of the different parts of the ship, and if they went on leave, there'd be photos. So it's basically like a glorified high school yearbook for those individual ships, and they go from 1946 all the way up into the 2000s. So if you have somebody who's in the Navy or who was a Marine who was on board a Navy ship, it's definitely worth it to go into Fold 3 and look at those cruise books. They're pretty entertaining. And what's neat about those is it gives you the sailor's service number as well. So there's, again, another avenue of research to pull that service number to request it from the National Archives. Another thing that they have are the headstone applications. So if somebody passes away between 1926 and 1956 is the collection that's digitized online that you have access to, those headstone applications. They do have them before and after, they're just not digitized. So they're at the National Archives too. You could look at the original applications, but digitized online, you have up to 1956. It's a 2-page card, lists the name of the soldier, it lists the unit in which he served. And on the back is the burial location, where the headstone is going, who's claiming it, what cemetery sexton signed off on it. But the reason why these headstone application cards are important is because the person, whether it's the wife, whether it's a family member, fills out the card, and then the US government verifies the information and makes corrections in red. So if for some reason I filled out the card for Angus and I said Angus was in the 47th CAC, they would cross it out and write 46, and they would correct the information. So the information you see on these cards are, if there's red marks on it, the red marks are the official designations from the National Archives, from the military, with the official record. Other websites, you have a whole handout just full of military records, everything from, you know, Sons of the Confederacy to, you know, Daughters of Colonial Dames are in there. So you have lots and lots of resources. You don't need to copy any of these down. They're already in your handout. But just some additional sources to keep an eye out for people who are looking for specific types of military interactions. Pritzker Military Library is phenomenal. It's right here in Chicago, right across from the Art Institute. They have a museum that you can tour with special collections, as well as their library. Their research library is available, and they participate in interlibrary loan. So if you find a book in the Pritzker Military Collection, your librarian could put in a request and have it sent to you. So it's an open lending library. And then I will answer any questions, both in the room and online. But first, I want to come back to two questions that were asked in the room. So for those of you who are logging in online, I had been asked 2 questions. The first was, well, what do I do if I've requested a copy of an official military personnel file from the National Archives in St. Louis at the National Records Office, and they come back and tell me it's a fire record? So the National Archives had a fire in the 1970s that destroyed about 76 to 80% of Army and Army Air Corps records. And these are from 1914 all the way up to 1960. Navy records and Marine records were untouched. They are still complete. They're not incomplete. If you request records and the archives writes back to you and says, no, I'm sorry, these are fire records, they will ask you to tell them everything that you know, which I kind of scoff at because I wouldn't be asking if I already knew. But what they're asking you for is, you know, where did they enlist? Where were they discharged? Do you know what military bases they were part of? Because what they're going to do is they're going to go back and try to recreate that information for you. They're going to try to contact the base. They're going to try to contact Archives 2 to see if there's any unit records. They're going to try to see if there's any hospital records in Kansas City for them. They're going to try to reestablish and rebuild a profile for you. If there's a file that was damaged in the fire but was salvageable, those records live in a different collection and they undergo, they're listed in the archives as an R. So if you're requesting files and you see a file listed there and there's an R, it's a reconstructed file or a damaged file. And they have a lab that goes and tries to treat these records and makes them stable so that they can give them to you to look at. So I have had fire records given to me to make copies of. But if they couldn't salvage it, then they'll try to recreate whatever they can find from these other sources. So even if you had requested a record a decade ago or several years ago, and they said, I'm sorry, this is a fire record, it's still worth it. It still is worth your time to go in and put in another request now, because a record that might have been damaged then, they might have had the chance to process and it might be available for you now. I'm going to NPRC next week, and 2 of the records I had requested to look at are considered fire records, and they're not available because since COVID, the reconstruction lab has been closed. But those records eventually, when the lab reopens, will be treated and I will be able to come down and have access to them. So even if it was a fire record from before, it's still worth it to go and request it again, just in case. And I just drew a blank on what your question was. Answer. Abbreviation. Yes. Okay, so the other question was, see, I'm getting senile in my old age. The other question was, what do all the abbreviations and codes mean when I'm looking at these different military records? Is there one place where I can go to look for them all? No. There's not an inventory that lists all the codes throughout history, but there are inventories of the codes listed by military engagement. So once a year, the government would put out these volumes, and they're at the National Archives on the shelf in the library at DC, as well as in St. Louis, where it's basically a roster or an inventory of the US Army or the US Navy. And it's like blue books or like city directories where they're done annually, and it gives a breakdown of the entire military. So all of the divisions, all of the units, all, you know, broken down into who the hierarchy is, who do these units report to, but then it has the codes of descriptions in them. But you can find them for the First World War, you can find them for the Second World War, you can find them for, but they're not all together in one volume that I have seen. Doesn't mean that somebody hasn't been working on it. But if you go out to the National Archives webpage, so if you go out to archives.gov, at the bottom, there's a little link that says Citizen Archivists. And you have the ability, if you click on that, you have the ability to ask them questions. So somebody responds usually pretty quickly, usually within a couple of hours. So they have National Archives employees who maintain this, but then there are volunteers from all over the world who participate and answer questions. So you could go into this, it's called History Hub, and it's linked through Citizen Archivist. But if you go to History Hub, you can say, I have this document. Here are the codes that I see. What does that mean? And you will probably have an answer within 24 hours. So if there's something specific, they're going to be able to answer it for you right away. And then you don't have to try to look for the books on the shelf at the library archives. Thank you. You're welcome. Are there any questions for me from the group chat?
So this question comes from Elizabeth. It says, my dad was on the color guard that brought home the colors from Vietnam to a parade in Fort Riley, Kansas in April 1970. I found photos, including some from Associated Press ones and several newspapers. I've reached out to the newspapers, the 1st Infantry Division Museum, and searched AP online trying to get a copy of the photos with no success. Any suggestions on where to get a copy of the photo?
I'd probably check with the State Department, because the State Department would have been involved in the planning of the activities. So the Army would be involved because the unit that was responsible, there'd be paperwork for them at Archives 2. So if she wanted to follow up on the planning schedule and everything for the unit, it would have the itinerary and the schedule and what time their flights and when the parade was. All of that would be in the unit file. But then the State Department would also be involved. So it would be worth it to go in and take a look. I don't know what the record group might break down to in the State Department, but if you go to the archives website, if you go to archives.gov, you should be able to do a search on the event, and it might bring it up, or you could contact the State Department directly and ask them. They took all kinds of photos because it would have been, what's the word I'm looking for? It would have been good press. It would have been good publicity. So they would have had their own photographers who were taking photos, as well as the AP taking photos. So I would definitely check with the State Department. Okay. And another thing about the State Department that we don't typically think about is that if you have somebody who's stationed overseas and they bring their family and the family's living on the military base, let's say it's Okinawa or it's someplace else, and there's a child born, the State Department is the one that's responsible for maintaining that birth record, because you're not going to have a stateside birth record because you're not born in the States. So if you had somebody, if mom tells a story about how she was born in the Canal Zone, the State Department is the one that's going to have those records of births for the military bases. Any other questions now that I've filled your heads? All right. Well, my email address is on the handout. So for those of you who were logging in from home, if you have any questions for me about specific military engagements or where to go for certain military sites, by all means, send me an email, because I'm perfectly happy to give you the links that I have. Anytime I give a talk, I can only show you a sample of things. Otherwise, we'd be here for weeks. So I can always provide more information. And that goes for all of you who are in the room. If you get home and you think, oh, I didn't think to ask about Merchant Marine records, send me an email. And by the way, Merchant Marine records for the Second World War and after are at the National Archives in St. Louis at MPRC. So they do exist. They're out there. Yes, sir. That's a good question. I would think that they would show up in the lists. I know for the First World War that they would do casualty reports that would include missing in action, killed in action, and wounded in action. So I would assume, based on First World War research that I've looked at, that yes, they would still show up in the same list as casualties. Because at least for those weekly casualty inventories for the First World War, they were listed. They were all separated out. So missing in action was first, then killed in action, then wounded, and then sick. And they ran those every week. And it would have the name of the soldier, the unit, and the service number. So I would assume that would carry over to the Second World War, but I can't say with 100% certainty. But I know the records for those who were captured, who were prisoners of war, are at the National Archives 2 in College Park. And there's an index to those for the Second World War specifically. So if you had somebody who was captured and was a prisoner of war, those records, the military records, the US records are there, but then there's also Red Cross records as well. So you'd cross-reference those with the Red Cross records that are at the Red Cross archives, which are at Stanford University, I believe. So those postcards, it's just the signature, your soldier is alive, he's captured, and those should be at Stanford. Who is responsible for death certificates? So it would be the military, be the unit. So if somebody's killed in action overseas, depending on the military engagement. So if it's the First World War, those records are called burial transfer files, and they're at St. Louis. If it was Second World War, they're called IDPFs, which is individual deceased persons files. And those are filed at NPRC, also in a different record collection. But the Army would be responsible for tracking the death. I'd still check the State Department to see if they filed a death certificate, but it should have come through directly through the military branch in the unit in which they were in. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you all online, and thank you all for being here. And I'm glad to have you. And happy Memorial.